all children cry the same, regardless of what language they speak or where they were born or their immigration status. And that got people thinking those could be my kids. My kids cry just like that.
Back in 2018, ProPublica released an audio recording that had been leaked from inside a detention center at the U.S. border. In an effort to terrify possible immigrants, the Trump administration instituted a family separation policy that tore children from the arms of their parents without any reasonable plan for reuniting them. The public was shocked to hear a recording of those little crying voices, and within days, Trump claimed to end family separations. Now, he didn't exactly do that, but what's even more alarming is Trump's family separation policies were rooted in American laws that date back 100 years or more, laws that are still on the books today. Efrén Olivares was on the front lines as a lawyer advocating for families against separation, and the work was personal. Efrén himself is an immigrant to the United States. He joins us to talk about his incredible book, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines. I'm Blair Hodges, and this is Relationscapes. We're exploring the ever-changing terrain of human relationships. Efrén Olivares joins us. Efrén, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks for having me.
Let's go to May of 2018, Efrén. You found yourself in a Texas courtroom with immigrants from south of the U.S.-Mexico border being detained there, and some of them had been separated from their own children. And as a human rights lawyer, you were there to collect stories. You were hoping to figure out what was going on and to help reunite families. So let's begin with an example of one of these families, Patricia and her 6-year-old son, Alessandro. What did you learn that day talking to them in that courtroom?
You know, when I encountered Patricia, we had been interviewing and representing parents separated at the border for a few days. And one of my colleagues had suggested that we start asking the parents about any medical conditions that they or their children might have, which in retrospect turned out to be a brilliant suggestion. So we started incorporating that question into our intake form. And Patricia shared somewhat equivocally, perhaps not wanting to share too much detail or not sure about the medical terms to use, that her son, her 6-year-old son, did have a medical situation. So I started asking more about that and what it was, what had happened to him. She shared, for example, that he participated in the annual telethon, which is a charity fundraiser for kids with disabilities. Mm-hmm. So I was familiar with that from having grown up in Mexico. So that told me right away that he had a disability. And then she shared that during his birth, he had swallowed some fluid. Mm-hmm. And my wife happens to be a pediatric occupational therapist who works with children with cerebral palsy and similar conditions. So I put 2 and 2 together. I'm not a medical doctor, but it might be something along those lines. And nonetheless, they were separated by the Border Patrol agents, despite having some medical condition that at the time I wasn't sure what it was. And it shocked me yet again that they were making no exceptions, even for the most extreme of cases.
Right. There was this new policy, zero tolerance. Talk about what that is. It's something the Trump administration had recently instituted at that time.
We're talking about May of 2018. The Trump administration had been in power for a little over a year. They had been talking about the southern border like they did even before the election, almost on a daily basis. And their big push at the time was the border wall. I was at the Texas Civil Rights Project, and we were representing landowners at the border. We thought that was going to be our big resistance to the Trump administration through legal means by representing landowners. Mm-hmm. And then this zero tolerance memo was issued in April of that year, calling for 100% of prosecutions for individuals who committed the misdemeanor of crossing the border between ports of entry. And by the way, it's important to keep in mind that that is a law that had been in the books since 1929. It's not a new law that the Trump administration passed or anything like that. And it had been used for those 80 years or so at the discretion of the prosecutors, like every other law, right? Prosecutors have discretion about which cases to prosecute and which cases not to prosecute.
And usually they would do civil violation for a misdemeanor, but you're saying there was something encoded in law that they could prosecute as a criminal violation, and that's what they jumped on.
Correct. A federal misdemeanor that carries the same penalty as running a stop sign at the Pentagon. And typically, everyone who commits such a misdemeanor is sentenced to what is called time served, which means that if you were arrested 2 days ago, your sentence is 2 days. So you have already completed your sentence, and then you go home if you plead guilty to this misdemeanor. What was different, and by the way, this memorandum from then Attorney General Jeff Sessions called for 100% of prosecutions of such misdemeanors, which meant it took away the discretion of the prosecutors, and it applied only at the southern border, not at the Canadian border, which I think is interesting to point out. And when that policy was announced, Attorney General Sessions explained that anyone who had a child with them when they crossed the border would be separated from their child. If you don't want your child to be taken away from you, don't bring a child with you. So it was from the very beginning, from its inception, intended to separate children from their parents, and that's what it did. In May of 2018, we hadn't started seeing the widespread systematic separations just yet. But a few weeks later in May, that it happened towards the second half of the month.
And so this is where you come into the picture and meet with Patricia. What was the separation like for her? Did she describe what actually happened when her and her child were separated from each other?
As with most parents, she was under the impression that when she returned to the Border Patrol station where she had left her son that morning, he would be there waiting for her. That she had been separated from him only to go to the courthouse for a few hours, go through this hearing, plead guilty of the misdemeanor, be sentenced to time served, go back to Border Patrol station, and the child is there. By then, we knew that that was not the case. And here is an important legal fiction that the Trump administration abused, in my opinion, to separate families. When somebody crosses the border and turns themselves in to Border Patrol, which is the vast majority of people who cross, Border Patrol is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So the parent and the child are apprehended, processed at the station under the custody of DHS. When the parent is taken to court to go through this zero tolerance hearing for the misdemeanor that we've talked about, they are under the custody of the Department of Justice. U.S. Marshals handle that. So when that happens, when the parent goes to court and is all of a sudden under DOJ custody, the child all of a sudden is alone in DHS custody. And legally, that is considered an unaccompanied minor. And then DHS sends them to HHS, Health and Human Services, specifically the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a separate agency, typically tasked with taking custody and handling children who cross the border alone. And that happens sometimes, right? You have teenagers, 16, 17-year-olds who are underage who cross the border alone. But that was not the case for these children. They were with their mom, with their dad, and because of this legal fiction that the government intentionally created, they were rendered unaccompanied. And by the time the parent, including Patricia, came back to the Border Patrol station, Alessandro was gone onto a different agency, a different bureaucracy, and getting them back together proved to be the hardest thing I've ever done as an attorney.
I can just imagine how panicked and how frightening it would be for a parent to endure this, and also what it might take to cause a parent to try to cross the border, to try to come here. What was the case for Patricia? Why was it important for her to come across the border?
She and her son are originally from a small town called El Encanto, the Enchantment, ironically, near the border with Guatemala, and the gang violence at the time was getting to them, and they were being persecuted. So, like many families who leave Central America, it was a last resort. And I think that's important to highlight because it's a misconception that people come to the U.S. by choice, and it is, for the vast majority of them, a last resort. When they have nowhere else to go in their own country, no other country to go to, and maybe they have a family friend or a relative in the U.S., and when they have no option left, that's what they choose to do, because nobody chooses to cross through Mexico on foot or hitchhiking as a first option. It's not easy. It's life-threatening. Many don't make it. So it's a last resort, and that was the case for Patricia and her son. She came to the U.S. to try to save herself and her son, never imagining that when she made it, her son would be ripped apart from her arms.
The other thing the Trump administration was doing at this time was trying to restrict reasons for asylum. So someone like Patricia and her son would be fleeing a violent or frightening situation. It's sort of like jumping out of a window of a burning building. Like you're doing this, as you said, as a last resort. But Jeff Sessions, the attorney general at the time, was saying, actually, we're going to restrict the reasons that people can even do that. So that's another element of this, is looking at asylum and trying to decrease the number of people who can even claim asylum.
There were a few attorney general opinions that were issued, and here at the risk of going too far into the weeds, but I think it's important to highlight that immigration courts and immigration judges are not part of the judicial branch like other courts. They're part of the executive branch. They are administrative agencies that serve under the Department of Justice. So the Attorney General can tell all the immigration judges, here's a new opinion, and this is how you apply the law going forward. So the relevant piece for Patricia was that persecution at the hands of gangs became no longer a viable reason to qualify for asylum. The Attorney General at the time decided that those were, quote, private actors, and it was not a reason of state persecution in a foreign country. And therefore, if that was your basis for applying for asylum, right out of the gate, you were no longer eligible. That was very intentionally directed at Central American asylum seekers, because there, the gang violence at the time, and to some extent to this day, was very high. The police, municipal police forces, state, and even in some cases federal police forces are co-opted by gangs. So it is
it's de facto government almost.
Disingenuous. Right.
Yeah.
It is disingenuous to say that this is not state persecution when the police agencies are taken over by the gangs, and then the gangs are going after families. So that was the case in the situation that Patricia found herself in.
Yeah.
With an asylum claim that would have been valid in the prior administration, but was no longer valid. And what is, I think, often lost in the conversation here is that those are the types of individuals that our asylum laws are specifically designed to protect, right? People who are fleeing for their lives. And we've, for decades, been proud about that. The United States being a safe haven for people who are being persecuted elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that was chipped away in very significant ways by the Trump administration.
And it's also important to point out that the United States has played a role in making some of these other countries unstable, because I think some listeners might feel like, well, I mean, it's too bad if they have those difficulties back home, but that's not really our problem. But as you show in the book, we actually have contributed to some of those problems, and the United States does share some blame in some of the unrest and gang violence and things that are happening in other countries.
The easiest and clearest and one of the most recent examples of that is Honduras. In 2009, a left-wing candidate was elected president, Jose Manuel Zelaya, and there was a military coup to oust him from power after he was democratically elected in open and fair elections. He won the presidency, and there was a military coup during the Obama administration while Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and the United States government officially recognized the military junta as the new government in Honduras. That led to significant political unrest. And a few short years later, by 2013, 2014, we saw the exodus of hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied children from Honduras after the political unrest. So there was a very direct cause and effect, right? Political unrest backed by the United States government leads to violence, and then teenagers, as soon as they start being recruited by the gangs, they flee. They have no option, right? And then we try to shut down our doors to them at the border when the very reason they are fleeing was caused in large part by our own government. And there are that example to me is remarkable because it happened during an administration that would ostensibly be pro-human rights and pro-democracy.
Yeah, you're talking about Democrats, progressives, liberals, thought to be welcoming and accepting, etc.
Exactly. And it's also very, very recent. So, because we can talk about 1954 in Guatemala, right? The overthrown President Arbez by the CIA and myriad of...
we were really in the mix at that point.
Right now, I mean, the 1973 assassination of the Chilean president backed by the CIA. But I don't want to use those examples because they feel too far back. It's like,
Sure.
oh, no, that was a different time.
Yeah.
We're no longer doing that. This is 2009. Barack Obama was the president and Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. It continues to happen to this day. And then we turn around and say, not here.
Right. And I mean, we could even debate like whether the United States involvement there was overall a good thing or a bad thing for that country. But I don't think it's fair to say that we shouldn't have to accept any consequences for our involvement. I think if the U.S. is going to be involved in foreign affairs and make these types of interventions or decisions, hopefully with good aims and sometimes not, and we really need to unpack that. But if we're going to do that, we need to be able to step up and take accountability and recognize that this is probably going to cause more border crossings. This is probably going to lead to unrest and build that into our plan. If we're going to intervene, we are also going to have to step up.
100%. And one example in which we have seen it is with Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, over 8,000 Ukrainian asylum seekers came through the U.S.-Mexico border. Mm-hmm. They made it to Mexico and then presented at the border. And all of a sudden, the United States Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection and other agencies were somehow magically able to process thousands and thousands of Ukrainian asylum seekers and let them in. And I am glad that they did. I'm glad because they needed it. They needed such protection. But that's how we receive Ukrainian asylum seekers, and contrast that with how we receive Haitian asylum seekers or Guatemalan and Honduran.
Precisely. And racism plays a big role here. We're talking with Efrén Olivares about the book My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines. And Efrén is the director of strategic litigation at the Southern Poverty Law Center, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Yale Law School. Okay, so to give people an idea of the scope, which we'll go into more a little bit later, over the next month or so back in May of 2018, up to 5,000 families would be impacted by this policy. It's actually hard to kind of track the numbers because some of it was done so willy-nilly. We're talking about children being separated from their parents on a scale that the United States has rarely seen. We'll go into detail about that. But before we do, Efrén, I wanted to talk about your own personal story, because as you worked with these families, you started to recognize some things about your own family, about what you shared in common with these folks, because you were born in Mexico. So how did your family end up in the United States?
I was born in Mexico, in northeastern Mexico, in the state of Nuevo León, where about 30 minutes outside of Monterrey, Mexico, the third largest city in the country. And for the first 8 or 9 years of my life, my entire life was expected to be in Mexico. All my family on my mom's side was in Mexico. On my dad's side, a couple of aunts and uncles had migrated years prior. But there were no plans for us to move. My dad was a truck driver in Mexico, and I was in middle school. And at that point, we're talking 1992, 93, my dad ran out of work. Mm-hmm. And by, chance, he happened to be a U.S. citizen because my grandfather had been born in the U.S. So he was able to get his citizenship and came to the U.S. in search of work. And his experience was driving trucks. So he found a job as a school bus driver. And for the next 4 years, he was in Texas driving a school bus every morning. My mom, my siblings, and I were in Mexico going to school, and he would visit us every couple of years, but we didn't have the visa to come to the U.S., so we couldn't visit him. He could visit us because he was a U.S. citizen. So, and
now, you said every couple of years. Was he visiting you every couple of months?
Sorry, I meant every couple of weeks, every few weeks.
Oh, okay, yeah, I was like, every couple of years? No.
My bad. He would visit us every few weeks, right?
Okay,
a week and a month.
That's better.
Or so.
Yeah,
yes.
That's better. Still hard, though. Still hard.
And, at the time, it wasn't clear to me what the plan was, whether we were going to be in this situation indefinitely, whether he would just work in the U.S. for a while and then move back with us.
Yeah.
Or whether we would eventually move. But frankly, at the age of 9, I didn't think much of that. When you're 9 years old, that's just the hand that life dealt you.
Yeah.
And
Dad's working, and I'm here with Mom, and I'm going to school.
My friends' parents would go to work and come back in the evening. My dad just came back a few weeks later.
Yeah, it makes sense. So what's interesting about this story is if I was to create a character to teach people about immigration and citizenship, I would create your family situation, because it teaches us so much. First, that your dad received citizenship through his dad because his dad was born in the United States. But then this strange fact that his own child and his other kids did not get citizenship. So talk about just those ways that people actually get citizenship and how it played out in your family.
Right. So generally, you can get U.S. citizenship two ways. Either you are born in the U.S. or one of its territories physically, or you are born to a U.S. citizen. The latter was my dad's situation, right? He was born to a U.S. citizen, my grandfather.
And back then, Grandpa would go back and forth over the border. It was a lot more just sort of like people would go and work and come back and go and work and come back, right? So
my grandfather was born in South Texas in 1902. He married late. My dad married late, so I have had older parents and grandparents. So and the first restriction at the southern border didn't go into place until 1907.
Mm-hmm.
The first significant immigration law happened in 1924, the same year the Border Patrol was founded, right? So the early years of his life, you would just go back and forth,
right,
guided more by the farming seasons than by any immigration laws. And by the way, it's interesting to note that at the time, Mexicans were not considered immigrants because the vast majority of Mexican workers came to work and came back. They didn't stay. So they were not immigrants. So they were not subject to some of these laws. In any event, when I was born, my father had not gone through the paperwork to get his U.S. citizenship yet. So I was not born to a U.S. citizen.
That's the thing that really killed me. I was like, oh no, a clerical thing.
Had he done it, 5 years prior, he did it when I was 5. Had he done it 5 years earlier, I would have been born a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
It's those, accidents or, the happenstance of fate. And that's why we found ourselves in that situation.
Yeah, and I think it kind of shows too, like, I don't know that your dad necessarily planned on going back and forth, or it seems that your family considered themselves to be Mexican, like that was home, and it really was economic conditions and circumstances that led to a need to change. So now your dad's going back and forth, and now he's trying to figure out how to do the family thing. Okay. So
another relevant sort of historical context, this is the early 90s. In 1994, people might remember, NAFTA was signed, a free trade agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. And that made it a lot easier for American companies to establish themselves in Mexico and have access to inexpensive labor in Mexico. But it didn't do anything to make it easier for Mexicans to come to the U.S., right? So what that did is that jobs went away in Mexico, so people had no work. And it contributed to an exodus of Mexican men in particular, including my father, to the United States. You look at the immigration statistics, and the second half of the 90s, the vast majority of people crossing the border were single adult Mexican men.
So again, U.S. policy, things that we're doing over here is impacting other countries and leads to border crossings and people trying to make conditions better for their family. We're going to see that time and time again. And there's a common phrase that people say a lot when we hear kind of the worst stories about how immigrants are treated or how immigration law is playing out. And the phrase is, "This isn't who America is." It's a common refrain, but you point out in the book that it's actually kind of problematic. And it can mean two different things, right? On the one hand, it could mean we should do differently than this. This goes against what our values are. This isn't who America is. But on the other hand, it can also give the mistaken impression that America doesn't have a long history of doing things like this. So what happened with the Trump administration was terrible and really caught the attention of the public, but it also wasn't necessarily completely new. And earlier, the Obama administration shared some blame for how it played out, but we can go all the way back. And you've mentioned a few dates, but I kind of want you to give us a broader overview of the history of immigration law and policy so that people know when they hear this isn't who America is, that we actually need to accept and own that this is who America is in some ways. So maybe take us back to, let's go back to 1790. This is when Congress was saying only whites who resided here for 2 years could become citizens. Take us there and then kind of bring us up through that history.
It was very common in the summer of 2018 to hear that phrase. This is not who we are as a country. This is not the real America.
Right.
From very well-meaning folks, from allies in the pro-immigrant spaces. So when I started writing the book, I looked into the history. Is that right? Let me take a look, right? What was the first immigration law in this country? And most people would be surprised, right? So the 1790 Citizenship Act, it was not an immigration law. It was a Citizenship Act that, again, limited U.S. citizenship to white men, excluding, of course, anyone who was not deemed to be white. And we can talk about what it has meant to be white over the years.
Yeah, because that changed too.
for the first 100 years of this country, there was no immigration restriction, right? Some people would call that open borders.
Borders.
Anyone who wished to come to the U.S. could come. And heck, they might even get some land if they do, right?
Yeah.
The state of California, interestingly, started implementing at the state level the first restrictions on who could come.
Wait a minute. The liberal state of California? Efrén, this can't be.
What today is known as California, as the liberal state of California, restricted the immigration of Chinese women first, and then anyone who was Chinese during the 1870s and then 1880s.
The railroads expanding and stuff, right? So they're trying to be like, hey, we want to control labor.
Right. That was bringing a lot of Chinese labor, frankly, to the United States, and there was backlash in California first because that's where they were arriving.
Yeah.
And then that sentiment expanded to the federal level, resulting in the first federal immigration law, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that was, to this day, it's the only law that explicitly names a nationality and ethnicity for exclusion. And that led to a significant problem. So from its very inception, right, the immigration
you got off on the wrong foot.
have been about exclusion, right? Limiting who can come.
Based on race, too.
At the turn of the century, there were, given what was going on in Europe, right, there were significant influxes of Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, who were not considered to be white. You look at the legislative history, and the main reason for excluding Irish and Italian immigrants is that they're going to poison the blood. of American and the Great Race. You had even the president at the time making explicitly racist statements as a reason for limiting who could come to the country. So in those years, the early 20th century, there were a hodgepodge of laws. For example, a tariff was levied at the southern border for anyone trying to come into the U.S. But the real limiting immigration law came in 1924, the National Origins Act, which put a quota on who could come to the United States every year. And those quotas were designed based on the census of 1890. So they wanted to freeze the demographic makeup of the United States as it was in 1890.
Like we have this percentage of white people, this percentage of Italians, this percentage of Chinese immigrants, this percentage of Mexicans, etc. And they're like, okay, we're going to make quotas that keep those numbers.
Exactly. And some proposals were to use the numbers from 1790.
Oh, boy.
Right. So that meant that over 85% of those quotas were reserved for Northern European countries.
See, but that reminds me of like the way that compromise usually works is like they'll ask for something absolutely ludicrous and then still get something that's pretty harmful and problematic passed because at least it's not that really terrible idea.
Absolutely, right? So then you have, there's photographic evidence of this. Ellis Island in New York, Angel Island in San Francisco, families, including children, in cages. The same type of hurricane fence cages that we saw in 2018 were happening in those years at the turn of the 20th century. And then the Border Patrol was founded in 1924, 100 years ago, to enforce those quotas, right? To make sure that people were not coming in larger numbers that was desired. In 1929, the illegal entry law comes into place on which zero tolerance was based, right? That makes it a misdemeanor to cross the border, what they call between ports of entry. So a port of entry is an official entry point where there's an agent that inspects your passport and whatnot. So to cross at a point any other than those official ports of entry is a misdemeanor. So you can be a U.S. citizen, but if you try to cross to the river, you can be found guilty of violating that law. And then the law didn't change again in any meaningful way until 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the current law that we have today. But before we got there, you have the example of World War II and the internment camps of Japanese Americans, including U.S. citizens.
Yeah, these are citizens, and they're put in internment camps.
And those internment camps also led to family separation because it was very common for the parents to be picked up and sent to one camp and the kids picked up from school and sent elsewhere.
Yeah.
So again, immigrant, and in this case, even U.S. citizens who were not deemed to be white, being put in cages and internment camps in those cases.
Yeah.
Then we have in 1965, which was, again, the last significant redrawing of our immigration laws.
Which is just wild to think about, by the way, that it's been that long.
Think about how the world has changed since 1965. I mean, cell phones were not around. The internet was not around.
Transportation's changed.
the way goods and services and information moves around the world would have been completely unthinkable in 1965 to the way it is today. And yet the way we try to organize the movement of people continues to be the same.
You say there were some positives, like it eliminated quotas. It also wanted to prioritize families and professionals. The idea was, hey, let's bring in people that can help strengthen the American economy or kind of live according to American values already. And we'll also allow some refugees. So it did away with some of the more problematic things previously, but issues continued. And the next thing you note in the book is that 1986 Immigration Reform Control Act.
Right. That was during the Reagan administration, widely known as an amnesty, where a lot of people received their permit to stay in the U.S. Legally. They got a green card, and then after being a legal permanent resident for 5 years, you can apply to become a U.S. citizen. So that was the last. It was not a new law. It was under the INA, the same law, but it allowed for that. In the mid-'90s, in 1996, as a result of this, war on drugs, tough on crime rhetoric that got both parties.
Yeah, Democrats were all on board with it, yeah.
It's important to know that Bill Clinton signed that bill into law, creating new penalties for immigrants that created bars that keep immigrants ineligible for citizenship in many cases. So that was the last significant law that was passed. After that, I would point to DACA as the other significant moment, although DACA is not a law. It was an executive regulation, an executive order, then, turned into regulation by the executive branch during the Obama administration.
The Obama administration also sort of helped set the stage by increasing family detention. So family detentions rose under the Obama administration, and deportations increased under the Obama administration. So again, the idea that when Democrats get into office, they will take a very broad or progressive approach to immigration just hasn't been borne out yet. We have not seen Democratic administrations improving matters for immigrants, for asylum seekers, etc.
It's one of the most concerning things that administrations that you would think are ostensibly on the side of human rights and constitutional rights, perhaps being somewhat short-sighted about the risk of a future in which a very anti-immigrant president comes into office. They do think. So Obama was the administration that started family detention. Before the Obama administration, children were never detained with their parents as a family unit. So that started there during the Obama administration. I can assure you that they never thought that Trump would be president, but he did. So once he came into office, there was an infrastructure already in place that then led to family detention. Now, I don't mean to say that it was the Obama administration who's to blame for the family separation crisis, but they contributed. They made it easier. And now, sadly, the Biden administration is making some of those mistakes again by limiting asylum at the border, by issuing this executive order that's saying that the border can be shut down, laying the groundwork for either a Trump administration in 24, or if that doesn't happen, then perhaps another administration in 28. Eventually, the Democrats will lose power, and so who knows who will come into office. And if you've laid down that legal infrastructure, it makes it way easier for an administration to simply flip the switch.
Right. And the Biden administration in 2021 did cancel the zero tolerance policy that was happening, but it left the old law in place that criminalized immigration, that made it a criminal thing. The loophole, basically, that the Trump administration found to do more than just treat these like little misdemeanors. So Biden leaves that in place, right?
That's exactly right. The law hasn't changed. The Trump administration issued a memorandum to institute zero tolerance and family separation. All the Biden administration did is rescinded that memorandum. Didn't change the law. So if you get another administration wanting to reinstate zero tolerance, all they need to do is copy and paste that Jeff Sessions memo, sign it again with a new date, and we're back in the same situation.
Do you know if that bipartisan border bill that they tried to pass that Trump spiked, do you know if that would have overturned that old, it would have left the criminalization in place?
Correct. That bill was silent on the what is called Section 1325 and 1326. Those are the sections about illegal entry. It wouldn't have changed that.
Okay. The other helpful thing your book does is lay out the administrative infrastructure that the government built up. So we understand that there's actually kind of an industry that exists around immigration. And when industry exists, people tend to want to keep jobs going. So we have the Department of Labor was enforcing things, but then the Department of Justice was. And then we had the rise of the Department of Homeland Security. And then we have ICE and the Border Patrol. And now we even have private for-profit companies that the government's contracting with. And so that incentivizes more detentions, more arrests, more... It's called crimmigration is the term you use in the book.
It is easy to forget that the way things are, they haven't always been this way, and therefore they do not need to be this way. Before 1980, there was no immigrant detention. You only had criminal detention. Now, we have a problem of mass incarceration in this country. I do not mean to say that that's fine. We have a serious problem there. But detaining somebody simply because of their immigration status was not a thing before the 1980s.
Right. See, and this is what everybody's saying. They're illegal. They're illegal. And I say, well, like, there's the phrase like, no person's illegal, which I love. But they're technically saying they broke a law. So they're like, no matter what. And this is what allows Trump's rhetoric to be able to say something like the immigrants are rapists, they're murderers, they're the worst ever, and they're all criminals. So he could lump in like someone like Patricia and her son in with people who commit some sort of terrible crime, and also leaving aside the fact that plenty of American citizens commit all kinds of crimes. Like the criminality of an immigrant is separate from the fact that they immigrated, except for the fact that there is this law in place that, like you said, like running a stop sign or something.
You know, people commit crimes for a variety of reasons, right? Some is for desperation, some steal to feed their families, perhaps mental health issues, the lack of societal support. There are a myriad of reasons, but the place of where you were born is not a reason why people commit crime.
Right.
Like, you don't commit a crime because you were born in Costa Rica, right?
Yeah.
So that is often lost. Also, the vast majority of people who are undocumented in the United States came in legally. They had a visa
They
overstayed the visa. The visa expires, so they've never committed even that misdemeanor of crossing the border. If you cross the border at the river or in the desert, but you want to apply for asylum, that is also not illegal.
Right, because you're applying for asylum.
You're applying for asylum, exactly. So all of that is often lost in the very oversimplified version of Trump and other demagogues.
And I would say in even Biden, in that, like when he's saying we're going to decrease asylum, et cetera, that doesn't really address how many people are immigrating or how many people are crossing the border. I just feel like some of his policies are definitely geared to public perceptions of Democrats are being too soft on the border, so we need to do something to signal that we're being tough on it so that we can, appeal to white middle-class Pennsylvania voters or something.
It's one of my pet peeves, the idea that the United States immigration laws are what drive migration flows into the U.S., right? And it's just bonkers because you look at the historical data of who is coming to this country, right? So in the 90s, you had adult Mexican men, not families. They were coming because they were out of work in Mexico. They were not applying for asylum. They were coming here to work. Then you have the coup in Honduras in 2009. Then you have Honduran teenagers coming. Then you have instability in Haiti, and you have Haitians coming to the U.S., Ukrainians. Right now, it's Venezuelans who are coming in large numbers because that country is falling apart, right? And when you've had natural disasters, hurricanes or floods, then you've had also exoduses of people. So it's those factors, what are called the push factors, right? That push people to leave. It's not what the White House is publishing on its website about the most recent executive order. So the idea that a country can alone dictate migration flows at a global level is just ludicrous, much less that a state alone, like the state of Florida with Governor DeSantis or the state of Texas with Abbott, can by themselves make a dent into migration flows is just uninformed at best. These flows are a result of many other things that are outside of our control. So the objective of being restrictive in our immigration laws is completely misguided, in my view. The objective should be to do it in an orderly way.
And anticipate global conditions and say, here's what we can anticipate. And I think the Biden administration tried to do this a little bit, and people make fun of Kamala Harris for this, but she was tasked with going south of the border into different places to sort of find out root causes and make some proposals. And I think that's a much better approach. And I don't know how much came of her efforts, but I think that is a direction that I would support much more than these surface level, let's just restrict by certain numbers and let's separate children from their families as a way to scare people And that was really part of the goal of Jeff Sessions and the Trump administration was terrorism, to frighten people and say, if you come here, you're going to be in real trouble. We're going to take your kids away.
It was absolutely intended as a deterrent. Or we're going to make your life so miserable here so that others will not want to come. In my view, the only way to address this is in a transnational way, right? So multiple countries in the hemisphere have got to come together and figure out a plan to make the flow of human beings orderly and humane, right?
Right.
And also, as it is the case in the law, there's a difference if you are trying to come to the U.S. to apply for asylum because the police in El Salvador are trying to kill you, versus if like you're looking for work and there's an employer in the U.S. who use your help to pick grapes or strawberries, and you want to come and you're willing. There's a supply and a demand that it does not take a rocket scientist to figure out that those could be matched. So there are two categories of immigration laws that come to play, but it's a lack of political will, time and again, that gets in the way, because the first Trump campaign showed, in my view, that taking this hard-line anti-immigrant positions won him the election, arguably, right?
Fires
so
people
now,
up.
Right.
And he's trying to do it again. We're seeing it with all the rhetoric about Haitians in Ohio, eating cats and dogs and taking over our country, et cetera. And it definitely fires certain voters up. And
the racist ones.
Exactly. And we need to call it what it is. We're talking about the book My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines by Efrén Olivares. All right, I wanted to talk to you, Efrén, about one of the most important moments in 2018. And this is when audio from inside of one of these detention facilities was leaked. And now people in the United States actually heard recordings of real children crying, calling for their parents, asking for help. And when this audio leaked and was published in the news, you actually avoided listening to it for a little while, though. So what was it like when you finally decided to listen to it?
In the first weeks of June, I remember multiple conversations with my colleagues about, like, there's got to be somebody inside these facilities who has a conscience, who's going to see something and they're going to snap a picture or record a video and get it out to the media, leak it anonymously or something. And once that happens, once people see what it's really like inside, then that's going to turn public opinion against this policy. Because throughout that time, you still had people saying, well, no, it's not the government's fault. It's the parents' fault because they brought their kids illegally into it. So that was extremely frustrating. And then, frankly, to my surprise, it was not a photograph or a video that leaked. It was an audio recording. And when it first came out, it went viral. ProPublica and a local outlet here in South Texas leaked it. And I, would overhear my office mates listening to the audio, and I was like, I don't need to see this. It was hard enough to talk to the parents every morning in court and hear their stories and try to console them while they sobbed as they told me what had happened to them, that I did not want to put myself through listening to that audio. So it took me well over a day to finally sit down and hear it. And it's about 8 minutes of children crying nonstop, asking for mommy and papi to come in and get them. And it's also a reminder, right, that for a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, this doesn't make sense. They don't understand. Mommy left me here. Why? Why won't mommy come and get me? From a child's perspective, that's what happened. That audio blare leaked on Monday night. And by Wednesday at 2 p.m., the president had signed an executive order purporting to end the family separations. Less than 48 hours later.
And notice the key word there was purported.
Purporting, yes. And I say that very deliberately because family separations continued at a lower scale, but they continued well into 2019 and 2020 and beyond. But it was a significant point, right? The scale really decreased in a way that, frankly, even surprised me. At that point, once people heard that audio and the cries of those children, then that was too much, right? That those sounds escaping from the cages crossed some line in the American psyche that was too hard. And I'm convinced that the reason that audio was so powerful and turned the public opinion against this policy in a way that perhaps a photograph or a video wouldn't have was because when you hear those children cry, you don't see the color of their skin.
Mm-hmm.
And all children cry the same,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what language they speak or where they were born or their immigration status. And that got people thinking those could be my kids. My kids cry just like that. Or that could be me when I was a kid. And that was too much, even for the harshest anti-immigrant bigots to tolerate.
Mm. And so federal courts actually order families to be reunited at this point. You've been fighting for this kind of thing this whole time by collecting stories, and you're trying to sue the American government. You're making a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on behalf of these families. You want international voices to get involved. And the federal court finally orders families to be reunited. But at the same time, the government refuses to do anything about it or to take the lead at all. They're just like, oh, maybe some nonprofits or other volunteers can take care of it. So it almost seemed like it was just window dressing. Like, okay, we're going to put this statement out of like, reunite everybody, but we're also not going to take responsibility and even try to make it happen.
Right. So the executive order that the president signed purported to end the separation policy, but said nothing about reuniting those who had already been separated. At the time, we didn't know how many. Some estimates talk about 5,500, close to 6,000 families. And then towards the end of June, a federal court in San Diego, in a class action brought by the ACLU and others, ordered a stop to the policy and reunification of children who had been separated from their parents within 30 days of the order. And that was just chaotic all over again, because when zero tolerance was implemented, there was no plan for reunification.
Yeah, they didn't even plan for it from the beginning. That's so frightening.
And it's so telling, right, that there was no plan. How are you going to bring them back together? I remember asking here in McAllen, how are you keeping track, right, of which kid was traveling with which parent? If you're sending the mom to Seattle and you're keeping the kid at a shelter in South Texas, how are you documenting that they were originally traveling together? Mm-hmm. And the response was that they were taking a family picture to know who was with who. But think about that for a second.
Well,
so you have cross-racial identification problems, which are significantly researched, but also then what? You have a photo of a kid, you go into a shelter looking for that kid, and that kid, oftentimes, if they're little, they know mommy as mom or mommy, right? They don't know their name. How is that a reasonable way to keep track? And that's part of the reason why many parents tragically were deported without their kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is what you started to see more and more. And what this was doing to families, to parents and children, was traumatic. And you were seeing it happen right there on the front lines.
Absolutely. I think it's important to put ourselves back in the position of where we were in May and June of 2018, because it's easy to say, oh, that family was separated for 3 weeks, for a month, 3 months, a year in some cases. But at the time, most parents did not know whether they would ever see their kids again. Think about that, right? For those of us who have kids, you don't know who your kid is, and you don't know if you're ever going to see them again.
You don't even know if they're alive.
Absolutely. Well, and think about the kid. The kid doesn't know where their mom or their dad is, whether they are alive, and when they might see them again. So that was a trauma. Right.
See, and they might even internalize it against a parent. They might feel like my mom left me. My dad abandoned me. Like the kind of trauma that can incur, even when you do reunite.
There was one mom who we didn't interview in McAllen, but my phone number got passed around, and she ended up calling me. She got crossed with her 6-year-old daughter, and we were trying to arrange for a phone call with mom and daughter. That was usually our first step, right? So they know that each other is alive and they can have an initial conversation.
Yeah.
That proved to be way more difficult than it needed to be. But the detention facility where the mom was, it's not used to arranging phone calls with a shelter for children.
Yeah.
And the same thing, the shelter for kids, they're used to arranging phone calls with a family member at home, not another facility. So that was very difficult.
The bureaucracy of it is maddening enough.
Absolutely. But in that particular case, it went on for weeks where they wouldn't get on the phone. And then one day, I remember vividly, she called me, right? And I would get on my phone the private ID or private caller because it was from a detention facility. I pick up the call, and it's Anna who's calling me. Mm-hmm. And I said, "Oh, Anna, how are you doing? Were you able to talk to your daughter, Julieta?" And she starts weeping on the phone. And I'm standing outside of my car on the phone with her, thinking, God darn it, not yet. Like, they can't even do a phone call. Like, come on, like, just frustrated. And then she says, no, I did talk to her. And she can't stop crying on the phone. Oh. And I'm like, oh, so you did talk to her. But so what's the problem? I thought, like, I was naively thinking she would be happy that she finally got to talk to her. Yeah, we spent the 5 minutes that we were allotted for a phone call crying. And she kept asking me, Mommy, why did you leave me? Oh. Why won't you come and get me? And it was just, like, I even felt guilty. Did I re-traumatize them by trying to make that phone call happen?
Yeah. Oh.
And it was just a stark realization of the perspective of what this did to a 6-year-old. Right? Her mom left her. She's upset at mom. It's that simple.
And we talked about the fact that this is America, that these separations are America, these border policies are America. But your book also points to groups that you are working with, to lawyers who rallied to represent these families, to volunteer groups who collected donations, in-kind donations and food and clothing, and volunteer groups that tried to help track people down and are still doing that in some cases, that this is America too.
Absolutely. I came out of that summer convinced that there is not a single America, because those folks are the best of America, right? Mm-hmm. People who dropped everything, in most cases retired people who just now devoted themselves to helping these families, getting them a backpack with an apple and a bottle of water for the bus ride to go see their kid, things like that. That is the promise of what this country can be. But so is the proponents of zero tolerance, right? Those two things coexist in our society, and we need to be real about that. And in my view, fight so that those who care about the rule of law and human rights have the better say at the end of the day.
America is a question mark that every single one of us is answering in what we decide to do.
Hear, hear.
Well, we're talking again about the book, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow. Maybe take a second to talk about where that title came from, the situation where My Boy Will Die of Sorrow came from.
I'm going to try to read a brief excerpt from the book about the title of the book. And this was the very first day I was in court interviewing separated parents, not knowing what I would find. I was there with one of our only paralegal in the South Texas office.
Yeah, you're
Georgina.
Pretty small outfit.
I was the only attorney and she was the only paralegal, so it was the entire team. And we were by the witness box of the jury. I was talking to one of the parents and Georgina was talking to one of the moms. So I was talking to Leonel from Guatemala, one of the dads that day. He must have been no taller than 5 feet 7 inches. In broken Spanish, he explained that he had come with his 11-year-old son, Daniel. Like Viviana and Sandro, another family, they were traveling alone and they were inseparable. He and Daniel were both first-time crossers and had no family in the United States. They were hoping to apply for asylum due to the persecution they had faced in their indigenous village. I got all the critical information from Leonel, but I still couldn't believe that the agents had not given him any information about his son, where he was being taken, or who would care for him. Surely the agents must have told him something about the process and about what to expect. I thought. What do you think would happen, I asked Leonel, if you are deported and your son doesn't go with you, if he stays here? He looked down, as if thinking about it. And when he looked up, he shook his head. His look was one of resignation. No, pues, mi niño se muere de tristeza. My boy will die of sorrow. For a second, my eyes didn't leave his. I struggled to write down what he was telling me. I pursed my lips and looked down, swallowed hard, and couldn't find words to respond. That's where the title of the book comes from that initial conversation with Lionel. And it is really meaningful to me that the title of this book is not even my voice. It's the voice of one of the parents impacted by this policy.
And your book does give a voice to those people, and it's a voice that we still need to hear because the problem hasn't completely been solved. There are still some families who haven't been reunited, and there are even some that may never be reunited because they didn't keep records, because we don't know exactly where everyone is. You do say, however, that there are some lawsuits that are pending for possible monetary compensation. I don't know what kind of odds those have. And also, we're not sure if there will be any accountability for anybody who helped institute these policies or anybody who carried through with them. So maybe take a second to talk about the state of things right now when we're thinking about consequences.
Yeah, so some of the families that we interviewed, the vast majority were reunited. We were able to get pro bono lawyers to take their immigration case for them, and dozens of them have gotten asylum, including Patricia that you mentioned. She and her son now have asylum, and they are on their way to becoming legal permanent residents. Some of those families brought lawsuits against the federal government for essentially torture, right? For the intentional infliction of emotional distress that they suffered at the hands of government agencies, and that they are entitled to compensation. Those lawsuits are winding their way through the courts. Best case scenario, those lawsuits will result in some money being given to these families. But to your point about accountability, those lawsuits will not in any way result in anyone being held accountable. Not former President Trump, not former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, not former DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. So they will not yield accountability. The only thing I can think of for accountability is hopefully not in the too distant future, something akin to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as has happened in other countries that have gone through significant human rights violations. It's happened in El Salvador and Guatemala. It happened in South Africa. We're many miles away from the political will in this country for something like that to happen. But I think that would be the only way to have a true reconciliation of what happened. I hope that my book can contribute to documenting that this in fact happened, because you never know. There are attempts to rewrite history and deny that this happened. I've heard interviews with Border Patrol agents who say, I don't know if any separations happened. I would need to take a look at the data, right? So it's a slippery slope. We need to be careful in this day of misinformation and disinformation. It can be very easy for people to try to deny that this ever happened.
Well, as we're talking about this, we're heading again into the presidential election of 2024, Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. It's closer than a lot of people might have predicted, and obviously we stand before a crossroads. And regardless of the criticisms I might have for Democrats and Vice President Harris, the things that Trump and Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance and other surrogates are promising and insisting on are frightening. They're worse than what we've seen with the family separation policies. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, other than just vote, like what are you thinking going into this election?
On the one hand, I am disheartened by how far to the right the immigration discourse has moved, right? And we are seeing now policies being implemented by Democrats that 20, 25 years ago would have been considered too extreme for Republicans.
Yeah, for like Ronald Reagan.
Right. So now the fact that what is acceptable has moved so far to the right is really disappointing. Now, as you say, disappointing is different than frightening.
Yeah.
Like what we are hearing from Vice Presidential candidate Vance and Presidential candidate Trump about what they would do. And they have laid it out explicitly in Project 2025, some draconian immigration policies and other policies that are really scary. But even if we don't, hopefully that won't come to pass, in my view, that those policies never see the light of day. And regardless who ends up being the president, I think that the immigration issue needs a significant reconsideration, right? Like you were saying, we have laws from 1965 that are outdated by decades. We're starting to see already asylum seekers who have been displaced due to climate change and severe weather events. under that law from 1965, that's not a reason to qualify for asylum.
Nope.
You cannot come to the U.S. and say, my village was destroyed by rising coastal tides. I need asylum. You don't get it, right? So we need to take a deep look at our immigration law and make it more consistent with the values that we say this country stands for.
Are you optimistic about it? Like, do you think this stuff is possible? Like, can we get to a place to even have that conversation?
Not with politicians. So I don't expect politicians to get there anytime soon. But with your neighbor, I encourage people to have that conversation, right? With the people that you know in your immediate circle. Because a lot of this racism and bigotry, I think, is coupled by lack of exposure, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-LGBTQ sentiment, or you name it, it's people who don't have any immigrants or people who are who identify as LGBTQ in their lives.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so easy to other them and blame them for problems and what have you. So I hope that at that level, right, we can start to make inroads and revisit what kind of country we want to be a part of. Forget about what others who came before us said or wrote. What kind of society do we want to live in? Is it a society that, it gives haven to somebody who's fleeing for their life and who all they want to come to do is look for work? Or are we not that? And are we going to be a society that judges people based on the place they were born or the color of their skin? And I think that's, among other things, what is at stake in this election. And I don't know. Some days are really tough. Other days, I am an optimist by nature.
Okay.
So I tend to keep coming back to the idea that I don't know if I will see this in my lifetime. But I hope to pass the baton to those coming behind me to continue the fight. And even if I don't get to see it in my lifetime, I think it's a worthwhile fight.
Well, the question mark of America is standing there, and we get to answer it. I hope that people will consider your book, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines, as something that they can read, recommend to friends, recommend to family, talk about, listen to podcast episodes like this, check in with media outlets that are reporting on immigration issues, and really get to know actual people who have immigrated and who are contributing to the United States and who are our friends and our neighbors and parts of our families as people get married and couple up. So your book is a great way to introduce people to the history of immigration policy, to see how it affected your personal life and your family, and then to see how the zero tolerance policies had such a tremendously negative effect on the families that were taken in by it. Again, the book is My Boy Will Die of Sorrow. Okay, so we always like to close, Efrén, with regrets, challenges, and surprises. Is there anything about this book that you would have changed now that it's already out? I mean, the landscape changes pretty quick, so you might always feel like, well, a book, it's harder with a book. You published it and some new news story comes out that might, change the landscape a little bit. Or what was the hardest part about writing it? Or was there anything that you learned in the process of writing it that really surprised you? You can speak to any of those.
Yeah, so I knock on wood that the Spanish version of the book will be out either later this year or in early 2025. So then that will mean that a lot of the families who are impacted by this will be able to read it.
Cool.
And if I had to do it all over again, I think I would have pushed harder for both the Spanish and English versions to come out at the same time.
Yeah.
Not necessarily changing anything about the book, but having both versions out together.
Yeah, that's great.
What surprised me, so on the one hand, it was cathartic to write the book, put it out on the page and get it out of my head and my body and what have you. But I learned a lot about me in the process, right? A lot of things that I had gone through as a child, as a teenager, that I hadn't thought about in years, that I hadn't fully examined about what it means to be an immigrant, to be separated from family in the process, and what that does to your identity. Then, because if you think about it, immigration, migration, by definition, entails separation from something. In most cases, it's your home country, but it is your home community, right? And it was surprising to me how common it is that in the process, people have been separated from a family member. It's not always a sibling, a child or a parent, but it's very often a close relative. So that's something that was surprising, how often people at book events or signings have come up to me and say, you know what, when I was immigrating to the U.S., this and that happened, and I never thought about it as a separation. But now that I read your book, I was separated from my mom, and for example, my former boss, came to the U.S. and when she returned to her home country to visit with her parents, mom was not allowed back on the plane because of a clerical error, and she didn't see her for years. So
Wow.
Those kinds of things are remarkably and surprisingly common, and that has been surprising, but also in some ways validating, right? That my experience and the experience of some of the clients that I represented are representative of what it is like to be an immigrant in this country.
Well, I'm so grateful for your work that you've been doing with immigrant communities, and also for the incredible work you did putting the book together. It is actually, for all the weight and difficulty of it, this is a book you want to keep turning the pages, and that's good. So I want to congratulate you on not just doing excellent work legally and as a lawyer, as an advocate, but also as a public voice who's bringing the story and just putting it in words that anybody can pick up and read in a book and understand. And that kind of work matters so much. And I want to say thanks to you for doing it.
Well, I really appreciate it. I hope people will read it and it will lead them to examine their own lives and how we fit into this puzzle that is the American experience.
Well, before we started, I asked if you'd conclude our discussion by reading an excerpt from the end of the book, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines by Efrén Olivares.
As with every December since I obtained my green card, I found myself driving back to McAllen after having spent a few days with my relatives in Mexico for the holidays. There were only a few days left in 2019, and with Julian and our 2-month-old daughter, Inés, in their car seats, Carla and I were pleased to find only a few dozen cars in line at the Reynosa Hidalgo International Bridge. This time of year, and especially in the evenings, it was not unusual to encounter hundreds of vehicles making their way back to the U.S. and to spend hours in line to cross the border. As we slowly made our way north over the bridge, some 50 yards to the left, on the Mexican-bound lanes, I could make out a few dark silhouettes of people sitting close together on the bridge. Those lanes are also used for pedestrian traffic, and those shadows were likely families trying to present at the port of entry to apply for asylum. But instead of processing them, immigration agents would now stop them right at the bridge's halfway point, where the technical boundary between the two countries lies, above an imaginary line at the middle of the river. A few days earlier, on our way into Mexico, we had driven past a group of no less than 20 sitting on that part of the bridge, waiting. They had been holding babies in their arms. Some would wait weeks, depending on the charity of passers-by to subsist, only to be turned away eventually. Others, especially those with young children, would try a few times, and after being rejected repeatedly, would try to swim across and turn themselves into a Border Patrol agent if they made it. Many were victimized by smugglers on the Mexican side. It was denial of asylum by attrition. This practice of stopping asylum seekers in the middle of the bridge, known as metering, was challenged in litigation, but thousands had been turned back in this way. How lucky we were, sitting in our air-conditioned car, our passports in hand to show the official at the window. Those families and mine had so much in common, and yet were worlds apart. Their children, like mine, were the children of immigrants. But theirs was a dire situation, ours a privileged one. They had left everything behind, we were simply coming back home. Like my parents years earlier, they were merely trying to do what was best for their children, and only they knew the desperate circumstances that drove them to this point. As we reached the inspection booth, I rolled down my window and stopped the car. The officer took a quick peek inside and asked the same question I've heard so many times. You a citizen?
That's Efrén Olivares, author of the book My Boy Will Die of Sorrow, a memoir of immigration from the front lines. And Efrén is the director of strategic litigation at the Southern Poverty Law Center and a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Yale Law School. You might have seen his writings on immigration policy in places like the New York Times, USA Today, and Newsweek. He's testified before Congress and at briefings on Capitol Hill about immigration and border policies. And he was also, by the way, the first member of his family to attend college. Efrén, thanks for talking to us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Relationscapes, where we're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other. And if you're enjoying the show, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. That's what Andrew Heiss did. He gave the show 5 stars, and he said this show helps us move beyond the stereotypical view of an idealized 1950s family. It provides a richer and deeper understanding of how families actually work, how social, cultural, political, and religious structures influence families. He says he's excited every time a new episode is released. Andrew, thanks for that great review. I'm excited when a new episode's released too. And I hope more people will take a second, like you did, to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or rate the show in Spotify. I love to read reviews. They really help bring more listeners to the show and also guests to the show. Also, if you're joining us for the first time, I hope you'll check out some other episodes of the show and recommend it to a friend. Thanks to Mates of State for providing our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm Blair Hodges, and I'll see you next time.